Thank you, Amanda. Dr. Doudna and Dr. Nelson, we are so honored to have you here with us. Let's start off by talking about your extraordinary careers. Science and academia have not always been a welcoming place for women. Could you talk about some of the early challenges you faced? What are some tools you developed along the way to survive in a male-dominated field? Dr. Doudna, if you could answer first on this one.
Well, I want to say what a pleasure it is to be here, and especially with Alondra Nelson. I've followed your career from afar for a long, long time, and it's really, truly inspiring for me to have watched your rise and to now have a chance to chat with you about, our mutual experiences in science. On my side, I grew up in a small town in Hawaii, in a family of non-scientists. I didn't have anybody to sort of follow in this career. And I honestly, when I was growing up, I didn't even know any women who were scientists. My vision of a scientist was kind of that poster we all maybe had seen of, the kind of the Albert Einstein wild hair. That was kind of how I imagined a professional scientist looking. And I didn't look like that. So I had to forge my own path. And I feel fortunate that I had mentors along the way who encouraged me at moments when I needed it. And I think that's something I always tell my own trainees now to look for, is people that will provide that kind of support and encouragement when we all need it. And also to stay true to your passions and not be dissuaded by people who might be naysayers, because we all encounter that in our lives as well.
Thanks, Flora. It's so great to be in conversation with you and with Dr. Doudna. It's great to see you, Jennifer, and so great to be in conversation. For my part, I grew up also in the West, not as far west as Dr. Doudna, in San Diego, California for the most part. And I was tracked very early on in science. And so my experience growing up, and also San Diego is such a science city, it's such a biotech city now, was, working in a medical hospital, working in a military hospital, weekend events at, the Salk Institute, summer science programs at UC San Diego, and the like. And I think it didn't occur to me until I was probably in high school or college that it was really because of Title IX that I was even able to be in those spaces. Even as being in those spaces, I was often the only girl, and certainly also the only girl of color. And I think for my generation, so I was 4 years old, I think, when Title IX was passed. You come into a world in which these possibilities exist. And if you have amazing parents like mine, they sort of send you out and convince you that there's nothing in the world you cannot do. But of course, there are landmines and obstacles and, folks who would tell you that this is not what you should be doing or trying to pursue along the way. And so in my instance, I ended up, becoming a kind of scholar and now practitioner of science and technology policy in particular. But it was really, it was really a path of not a pipeline, as we sometimes talk about in STEM, but really a kind of obstacle course, and very much aided by great mentors, much like Dr. Doudna. I think what mentors do when they're really helpful is allow you to see a kind of future and possibility and pathway for yourself that you can't imagine for yourself at the time. And so I think certainly for women in science, for women of color in science, mentors are really important for having that vision.
Dr. Nelson, your career has been defined in particular by your embrace of interdisciplinary thought. You talked a little bit about this in the science that surrounded you as you grew up, but also in the books and in the work that you've done since. It really touches on a lot of subjects. And there's a real focus on it toward justice and equity. What are some of the ways you've been able to apply that through your work at the Office of Science and Technology Policy?
Oh, thank you for that question. I'm so proud and honored every day to serve in this White House that cares so much about equity, that has made it a kind of day one commitment, which means that in an Office of Science and Technology Policy, you can take equity as a given from the very beginning. And I don't think that that's ever really happened before. So what that means, in the work that we do in the office is that we are constantly thinking about how we make policy in ways that ensure that science and technology research and development, the outcomes, the availability of the amazing things that science and technology make possible for us are available to the most number of people, and really take seriously that it is the job of government to do that inclusive and expansive work of including people. I think what I bring to it from my own research work as a scholar of science and technology policy is an understanding that like innovation is amazing and breathtaking. And we, in Washington, we're working every day to really drive that forward. But also I think an understanding that there have been very uneven roads, pathways and very uneven access to the benefits and to participation in science and technology. And that's just a truism. It's not a condemnation of science and technology or STEM, but it means that we need to really take that history and really think about what that means for how we do policy making. So I think one has to be just forthright and honest about what has come in the past, and also I think drive forward with promise and possibility, in a sense that what has been in the past for science and technology research and policy doesn't have to be its future, and that part of how we change that is being very strategic about how we are sure to very strategic about how we include women and women of color at that table.
And my next question is for you, Dr. Doudna. You're one of the few women to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and it was awarded to you and your early collaborator, Dr. Emmanuelle Charpentier, who of course is another woman. So, that was a glass ceiling right there that you guys were able to punch through. So could you tell us a little bit about what the day of the announcement was like and what some of your thoughts were as you prepared to address the world?
Well, thanks for that question. It was an extraordinary day, as you might imagine, highly unanticipated and not something that I think any scientist can expect in their career. I think the thing for me that's been maybe the most remarkable about the experience has actually been the number of young girls, especially, who have reached out to me. I still get contacted almost daily by young women. They're often in high school, sometimes even younger than that, but often high schoolers or just thinking about going to college, who want to understand a little bit more about my path and are asking for either guidance or just a little bit of support as they make their journey forward in science. I think this speaks to the fact that recognition in science goes far beyond the individuals involved in that recognition. It really speaks to the value that we as a society put on science and technology and the folks that are advancing it. And we want to encourage the next generation, and we want to encourage the widest diversity of participants as possible, I feel. It's not only the right thing to do, it's the best thing to do for the science and the technology. And I think that for me, that was really exciting about this Nobel announcement, was the fact that so many young women in particular were inspired by it.
That's wonderful to hear. We're going to touch just briefly on this, but I wanted to make our audience aware of both of your parts in this worldwide effort. Can you talk a little bit about your respective roles in the fight against COVID-19, starting with Dr. Doudna and your research, and then later, Dr. Nelson, we could take over the handoff and talk about your efforts through policy?
A few years ago, I started the Innovative Genomics Institute. That's the shirt I'm wearing here. And it's a partnership between UC Berkeley and the University of California, San Francisco. So 2 campuses of the University of California, with the express purpose of applying CRISPR technology for solving real world problems, and doing so with an eye towards access and affordability. We want this technology to be as widely available as possible. Because of that, the existence of that institute, we had already assembled quite an amazing team of scientists and trainees who were part of it. And so in early 2020, I guess it was, that it was clear that the pandemic was upon us. We got together with our team and said, what can we do as scientists? How can we apply our expertise in the face of this global public health emergency. And so several things emerged from that. One is that we were able to put up a testing lab quickly at our institute. And it's quite an extraordinary feat. Probably wouldn't have happened without the pandemic, honestly, but we got approval all the way up at the level of the governor of California to have a CLIA certified clinical lab on the Berkeley campus running PCR-based tests for COVID-19. And that allowed us to service not only the campus community, many tens of thousands of people who were impacted, but also the wider community in Northern California. And amazingly, for a long time, we were the only testing lab providing testing to firefighters and police, as well as the folks that work in the California Energy Commission who needed regular testing because they were working on site. And so that was, just really kudos to all of the volunteers that were willing to risk their own health at a time before vaccines were available to come in and run tests. The other thing that we did was to implement a wide collaboration across academic labs and companies to make not only that testing lab possible, but also to begin exploring ways that CRISPR could be used directly as a diagnostic approach. And this involved collaboration with companies like Salesforce and Thermo Fisher, but also with partners at the Gladstone Institutes and at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, who brought their expertise to the table. And again, in many cases, without getting direct recognition for their work, without worrying initially about funding for their work. We had fortunately had donations from a number of philanthropists to keep us going financially. And so I think this really speaks to the value of teamwork. It's been amazing to see how much could be accomplished so quickly when people get together and put their expertise to align it to bear on a problem.
So for my part, let me just say to begin that I was one of the people deeply inspired by Dr. Doudna's being a recipient of the Nobel Prize. It was just, I think, inspiring for not just young people and little girls, for older folks as well. And it continues to be a source of great inspiration. So for my part, I would just, to begin, I would say, President Biden really tasked the Office of Science and Technology Policy with sort of thinking about the lessons that we've learned from COVID-19. And this has sort of included a few things. I mean, part of it has been moving forward with some work around pandemic preparedness. So what do we, what are the sort of, how, if this happens again, and as it's happening now, what do we need to know with regards to vaccines, with diagnostics, therapeutics, some of the work that Dr. Doudna was working on? How do we get ready for the next pandemic, even as we are also, tasked and part of OSTP with helping us think about how we live in the current, with the current pandemic. So in that regard, I think, sort of what are we're thinking quite a lot about like, what are the implications for society and for science and technology policy, in a world that's changed with COVID, like what do we need to do to live in that world? One of the projects that we've been working on is around clean indoor air, is lifting up the work of the CDC and the EPA around the fact that, clean indoor air can really help to reduce people's exposure to COVID-19 and to other infectious diseases, and indeed can help us be more healthy overall. So that is, a pivot from some of the work that's happening in the White House that's really about the day-to-day response to the pandemic, to really sort of thinking, as OSTP does in its work, a little bit into the future or a little bit into the present about what we need to do to keep moving forward. We've also been, it was clear from COVID-19, from our experience of the last 2 years, that we didn't have the data that we needed to really understand what communities were being impacted, how they were being impacted, whether or not there were different kinds of frequencies of disease, of mortality, of infection in different communities. One big endeavor of our work at OSTP and of the Biden-Harris administration has been a body called the Equitable Data Working Group. And part of that is to sort of think about strategies that allow us to have data that can answer questions about who's being impacted differently or disproportionately, and then for government to be able to respond to communities that are most in need. So that's some of the work that we've been doing. And then, of course, as a sociologist of science, I bring to the office real questions about scientific communication, around trust in government and institutions. How do we think about the space of trust and information integrity in the context of this pandemic, but also in the context of how we communicate about science and technology, research and policy more generally?
And building off that, I'd like you to answer this question first, this next one. We are, we are in a time where there are a great number of developments with big impact on humankind. We have the mRNA vaccines, which are relatively new. We have things going on in Silicon Valley that will continue to affect our lives for decades to come. And both of you, through your work, you do a lot of work in the realm of ethics and how discoveries and technology can be used to make society better. And could you tell us a little about your guiding principles, about some of your goals when you're making these decisions, and also some of the biggest dangers we may face?
Sure. I think, one of the things that was the founding mandates of OSTP that I think often gets lost, if we're going to talk about the work that we're doing at the White House, is that when the office is established in 1976, the congressional mandate, the statute says that we're both supposed to offer advice about new technologies and how they can benefit American society, but also to think about possible unforeseen consequences. So that in 1976 was part of the founding mission of the office. And so today we might think about it as ethics, but I think it's clear that the work of policymaking, in addition, is, I think ethics is certainly, and bioethics in particular, is certainly a part of that, but that there are ways that we need to be thinking as the pace of innovation quickens about how there will be, these changes, which will be we need to be thinking about what we can do to make sure that these changes or innovations are beneficial. And so part of how we've been thinking about that in the office is really thinking upstream in the innovation kind of pipeline. So right now, we've been tasked with the president with thinking about digital assets and cryptocurrency. And in that work right now, we're thinking already, before there are any kind of government decisions made about this, about what might be the climate implications of that. So these are kind of two, Flora, to your point, like two big challenges. The climate crisis, climate change is a significant challenge. What are the most significant challenges of our time? And it's also important to have innovation in the space of currency and assets, particularly for communities that are unbanked and don't have access to resources. And so how can we do a kind of science and technology policy around digital assets, but also around artificial intelligence that is sort of thinking about both the benefits and the unforeseen consequences, and then sort of creating policy that is nimble and is dynamic as the sort of systems and innovations that we're building out.
It was clear early in the work that I was doing with my collaborator, Emmanuel Charpentier, on CRISPR-based genome editing, that this field was going to have very significant impacts in society in the future, and would come along with ethical concerns and issues about responsible use. In the beginning, I felt like I had no grounding, certainly no professional background in ethics or bioethics, but I realized that if I didn't get involved, who would? I had to get involved because I was there at the genesis of the technology. So that for me has been a really inspiring part of my journey over the last decade, is all the people that I've met who are more than willing to share their expertise, to get involved in this field. The implications of genome editing span everything from the impacts and the potential impacts in the environment, in agricultural uses of genome editing, to things like manipulating the human germline, meaning making changes in human embryos that become heritable in us as humans. And the implications of that, of course, are quite profound. So it's it's been not always a smooth path, that's for sure, but incredibly important that scientists are involved in this and in this work and in this now global conversation. So I was proud that our institute was the first to convene a meeting on this topic back in early 2015. And that led to the national academies in the US and the Royal Society in the UK teaming up to work together, and eventually with the academies in Asia as well, to sponsor global meetings on the topic. And that has, I think, been critical to putting the word out, getting scientists around the world to think about these issues, to engage on them, and importantly, to connect with people who are not scientists, but are stakeholders in other ways, whether they are people who are affected by genetic disease, whether they are people who are concerned about the environment and who isn't these days. So I think that that this has been a critical role now of the and now increasingly this is being taken up by the World Health Organization, by the UN. So it's been important, I think, that really just emphasizing that it started as a grassroots effort of a few scientists saying we need to get out in front of a really groundbreaking technology that has great value but also comes along with risk.
If I could just add, Flora, I mean, I've been, Dr. Doudna has been such a leader in this space, and really, as she was just describing, thinking early on in the technology. I mean, scientists and technologists know better than the general public what are some of the transformative possibilities for good and for bad of the technologies that they're working in. And her leadership has been extraordinary. I mean, the germline editing affects the entire all of human population, so it's not just a choice about one scientist or one lab. And so it's been, inspiring to watch her leadership there and on this important topic.
Is this something that we will be looking at from a federal policy perspective anytime soon? We've got federal policy around genetics and genomics. I mean, and we've also got pretty good ethical norms. So, the national academies and some of the work that Dr. Doudna was talking about, have participated in conversations, and, there have been strong recommendations that, human germline editing should not be done, and that there should be, I think, norms and guardrails around other kinds of gene editing. We've got, CLIA laboratories, like the ones that Dr. Doudna mentioned, are regulated by the FDA. The NIH has a role here. So there's regulation, but I think I think if we take Dr. Doudna's example that she started, the work that she started doing in 2015 to really to be thinking about the social implications alongside the technology, I think the bigger lesson here is that as a kind of case study or a pilot or a model for how we should be thinking about the ways that scientists, social scientists, and should be working with members of the public around a variety of innovations. So CRISPR certainly is a key one and a very important one. But as I mentioned before, something like artificial intelligence, quantum information science, or all sorts of things sort of coming down the line that we really need to be thinking about as a society, as a global community. Yeah, these are all big questions, and it's going to take a while to get them all answered, I think.
And you've got women leading the way.
I sure hope so. And that brings us back to Title IX, which we are here to celebrate, and we're here to talk about this grand piece of policy and its role in making playing fields, classrooms, and ultimately the workplace more gender equitable. So I have a question for each of you. Dr. Doudna, what are some of the ways your field has improved in terms of gender equity?
It's been amazing. I mean, I think we're seeing the fruits of some of the work that's gone in over the last few decades now, where we see increasingly women who are in leadership roles, whether it's in academic settings or in government public policy, like Dr. Nelson, or in business and biotech. There's more work to be done for sure, but I think we're on a good trajectory. I'll also just mention that my first experience with Title IX was actually when I was still in school in Hawaii, and I had a chance to play on a soccer team. First girls soccer team that my school had ever had started while I was there, and probably wouldn't have been in existence without Title IX.
Yeah, well, certainly it was true of my, high school track team. I think, indeed, I think the high school that I went to was not even coeducational a few years before I started going there. So things have changed very quickly. I would say, I think I would add on to it or agree with what Dr. Doudna said. Certainly women's access to and girls' access to educational opportunities, to after school programs, to athletics, there should, effectively Title IX, building on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, effectively says there is no space in society, no institution that has federal support that should be closed or constrained or limited by gender, and that women and girls should have access to all of these things. And, it still remains a really powerful and awesome statement of who we aspire to be as a society. Obviously, it has allowed me to be in, educational spaces and athletic spaces that I might not have had access to had I been born even a decade before, 15 years before. But there's still a lot more to do. And I've been really encouraged by, I think quite a lot about rights, about civil rights. It's part of how I think about equity in science as well. And one of the, over the last sort of decade or 15 years, one of, I think, the more inspiring, episodes for me has been how young people, particularly young women, young girls of color, have really taken up Title IX as their own, really in a way that, so, I understood, I guess, some abstract relationship to Title IX and my ability to do things at school and in the world. But, young women today really understand that it is, very clearly that it is a right that they have, and it is a lever that they can use in their politics. And I find that really inspiring, and also both on the level of what young people and young women in particular are doing, how they're trying to leverage the right, but also that our civil rights, that our gender rights, our human rights, are things that we are always renewing, reasserting, that these are living things in the world. And I think as we celebrate this anniversary, that's one of the more inspiring things to me. Like, it's the 50 years is not like a law up on a shelf. It is kind of a living, breathing thing in people's lives.
All right, one last quick fire question, because we're about out of time here. If each of you could just tell me in one sentence, what would you say to a young woman or a gender diverse person who's interested in science? Dr. Nelson, you want to take this one first?
I would say, what would I say? I would say, don't, have no boundaries, allow no other people, no law, no institution, no others to set the boundaries or the, for what you might be or do in the world. And I think I say that, going back to an earlier comment, as a kind of mentor to unknown others who are sitting with us in this conversation today, which is to, help them to sort of boldly see a future for themselves that they might not be able to see for themselves. So don't accept boundaries.
And I would say, just following up on that, couldn't agree more. And, be bold, be visionary, and look for people that will support you in your journey. I do think that is really critical for everybody, but certainly for folks that are coming into a field that has traditionally not been as welcoming, and where we really want to see diversity, playing a key role in the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doudna and Dr. Nelson. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts with our audience today. It means a great deal to us.